Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. My name is Jean-François Saznek. I'm a scholar at the Middle East Institute. I'm also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And for over 30 years, I've been teaching about the politics of business of energy and the politics of business and energy at Columbia, Georgetown, and SAIS. So it's really a pleasure for me to introduce this the book on cronyism by Diwan, Malik, and Atiyas. It's really interesting to me, especially since I've been a banker in the Arabian Peninsula for 10 years and worked for Arab banks outside the region for many years since then. Um, of course, the crisis of 2011, the Arab Spring, was in great part due to people rejecting the takeover of the economies by a limited number of families and people in favor of an even smaller number of people. So the book, which is we're introducing today, is really seeking to shed a lot of details and very intricate analysis on cronyism and clientelism in business relations between some business families and the leadership. It's a very detailed and dense book, which covers Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, the Tunisia of Ben Ali, and Iran. But it doesn't cover the Gulf or Syria or Iraq, which for reasons which, of course, would make the book very, very big, but also for reasons which the authors will probably explain to us. In any case, it is with great pleasure that I'm presenting to you Adeel Malik, of Oxford University, and he's teaching and doing a lot of things in various in the various areas of the university. Ishac Diwan is a chair of the socio-economy du monde arabe à Paris Sciences et Lettres, and they will introduce the book. After they introduce the book and show us a few slides, Karen Young of the American Enterprise Institute and one of the most prominent economists, economic scholar of the Arabian Peninsula in the US will be our discussant. Each one of the presenters will talk for about 10 minutes or so, and it will be followed by questions on the Q&A, which I will see the questions, and hopefully I will translate the questions to make them short enough for people to discuss this very important book today, and will be finished within an hour. The book, of course, is titled Crony Capitalism in the Middle East, as you can see, and it is what do we know and why does it matter, which of course it does. So thank you very much, and maybe we can start. Maybe Adeel, you want to start?
Thank you, Jean-Francois. This is obviously joint work with Ishac Diwan and Izak Atiyas. And I'm going to be able to provide you very briefly the overall scope of this project, and then Ishac will take over. I think a good starting point for us to think about this subject is this plot, which basically plots the proportion of people who view corruption in businesses, which is on the y-axis, and the proportion of people who view the government as being corrupt. And the startling fact about this plot is the almost perfect one-to-one correlation between the two, which is to say a lot of people, when they're asked in public opinion polls, the extent of corruption in government and business, those perceptions correlate. And to scholars and observers of Middle Eastern political economy, this hardly comes as a surprise, because across the Middle East, corruption in government and business is often perceived as the same. A starting point for thinking about these questions was this great book by Stephen Haidman, Networks of Privilege in the Middle East. That book looked at the era of economic liberalization from the late 1990s onwards and reached a very important conclusion, which is that in the era of economic reform and liberalization, when the state's role receded, it led to the emergence of new networks of privilege, networks of cronies who were allied to the state and monopolized all economic opportunities. Now, that was a fascinating argument and a very important addition to the literature. What we do is to upscale that argument and bring greater rigor, empirical differentiation, empirical specificity to this debate, and compile a lot of fascinating fine-grained information about the nature of cronyism in the Middle East, the mechanisms through which such cronyism takes place, and the impact on economic performance. I'll focus on the first two, and Isaac will take over from there. Now, as I showed you, the basic period we are going to focus on is the post-liberalization era. It's the era after economic reform kicked in. It's really the period late 1990s onwards. What we do is to really compile fine-grained information on politically connected firms. And that's one reason, Jean-Francois, we were unable to do work on Iraq and Syria and Gulf, because it's harder, at least at this stage, to compile such information. The larger approach of the project is to determine who are these politically connected firms. And for that, you obviously need to look at a lot of information, qualitative and quantitative, and often it's in the public domain. Often it needs expert interviews. And then we combine this information with highly fine-grained data on firms, on sectors, some of which is publicly available, like World Bank Enterprise Surveys, UNCTAD. Others are specialized industry tech censuses that our authors were able to get hold of. In terms of methods, we draw on a very eclectic range of empirical methods, drawing on dominant methodologies in political science, sociology, economics. Some of our chapters use discrete events, such as elections or revolutionary overthrows of regimes, policy shocks, such as trade agreements. Some chapters build a causal identification, so they could say how cronyism causes certain outcomes. Others are more descriptive. Now, first things first, how do we identify politically connected firms? And to do that, we really our starting point is the gold standard in the literature, which is Facio's work, not on the Middle East, but on many other countries, where he looks at, classifies a firm as politically connected firm if the owner or the top manager of a firm is a member of parliament, a minister, head of state, or connected with regime insiders through marital ties or other linkages. And in this sense, this sort of approach is quite conservative, because we look at first-degree linkages rather. There obviously could be some cronies that are missed, but the approach is quite conservative. And if anything, some of these results will be stronger in the case of a more comprehensive exercise. Now, of course, we focus also on Turkey and Iran. And in both of these contexts, they're not politically connected firms as such. They're either, in the case of Turkey, business associations, which can be religious affiliated, sort of AK Party affiliated firms, or more secular firms. In Iran's case, it's the institutional ownership of semi-public entities and conglomerates. So in both of these cases, the underlying political economy suggests that their political and organizational interests are more important than family or personalized networks. Now, here's a little chart that you would have seen. It came in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, when information on Ben Ali and his wife's growing stakes in the economy, about 220 firms that they owned in different parts of the economy, came to light. And as you could see, between the two of them, they controlled 220 firms that range from hotels to TV productions, cement factories, car dealerships, and what have you, even the monopoly on tuna exports. And this really unearthed a fascinating network of economic interests that, in a sense, sort of sustained the regime. In Morocco, we were able to look at firms that are affiliated with royal family, and then the sort of Maqsam, the foundation board members, royal advisors, and then the sort of cabinet members. So one of the key distinguishing features of this project is that we are able to not only identify politically connected firms, but we could also differentiate them by type, such as royal cronies versus non-royal cronies. In Egypt, for example, we looked at a lot of Ishaq's work, is seminal in that regard. He looked at a lot of these linkages that existed in terms of families that were MPs, were chairman of housing committees, industry and energy committees, the same committees making important economic decisions and allocating privileges. The case of Az family, Gabr, Kamel family, these are all well-known cases. which we were able to highlight in our empirical work. Now, the overall picture we get is that there's a large, substantial, and growing presence of cronies in the 2000s, in the run-up to the Arab Spring, that decade of 2000s. But there is indeed variation over time between countries and across sectors. And this table gives you an interesting pattern of that variation. Is the percentage of ISIC 4, industrial classification 4 subsectors that are penetrated by cronies. And there are indeed some sectors like food products and beverages, which are 47 to 60% of the sectors are penetrated by cronies. Others, where Tunisia, textile, you don't find any. In Egypt, Morocco, a lot of activity, similar patterns of variation that are ultimately rooted in the specific political economy of these countries. In terms of variation, we find Egypt is probably had the highest exposure to cronyism, with about 50% of the subsectors. And you could see that this presence actually increased over time. So in 1996, and then you look at 2011, the presence of crony in a typical manufacturing sector sort of more than doubled. Now, the corresponding ratio in Tunisia and Morocco was around 40% of the overall manufacturing space, and 20% for Lebanon. So there's quite a bit of variation, but you see growing crony presence. In Turkey, we find that firms that were affiliated with religious business associations comprise about 20% of all firms. Now, in Morocco, for example, you find that not only are number of crony firms increasing, you could see from 1990 to 2010, there's a huge increase in crony firms. And these patterns are preserved if you were to scale them by total number of firms operating in the economy. And what's more interesting is that there are differential stakes in traded versus non-traded sectors. So while there is an increase, a slight increase in traded sectors, the red line, the non-tradable sector is where you see a lot of activity in Morocco. And that's easy to understand because a lot of the stakes of the royal family are in finance, real estate, or those sectors which can be protected much better through regulation. In Turkey is an interesting story where the religious network firms, which is the bottom black line, was actually relatively unimportant up till about 1997. And from 2000 onwards, you see a growing participation in the economy, with the result that they're today either more important or at least as important as many of the other firms. Now, the second piece of information that I would like to provide to you is to give you very concrete, fine-grained understanding on mechanisms, how firms rely on subsidies, financial sector, privatization, etc. And what I'm going to do is to zoom you through different slides, and each slide presents to you evidence on one of the mechanisms in an empirically refined way. So in the first slide, I present a plot from Ishac Diwan's paper on Egypt, where he showed how crony firms are largely concentrated in high energy intensive sectors because they probably want to capitalize on energy subsidies. So 45% of the firms are in energy intensive sectors compared to other sectors. Finance emerges as a very important avenue. Mohammed Obinal's paper in Morocco looks at the pattern of interlocking board memberships where different cronies share their board memberships. And he shows that actually a lot of the regime insiders sit on multiple boards of financial and non-financial firms. And finance emerges as the linchpin in the larger network of cronyism, because it's partly by controlling finance that the royal family is actually able to control the other parts of the economy. So it sort of highlights the centrality of finance. Judge Haban's paper on Lebanon presents similar evidence. This is well known to observers of Lebanon, that a large part of the Lebanon's banking system, about 43% of the banking system assets are controlled directly by people who are either members of the parliament or big political oligarchs. If you bring in indirect networks, then the ratio actually increases. Privatization was another important avenue for privilege. A lot of the privatized firms went into the hands of cronies. In this plot by Bob Reichers and Laila Baghdadi, we learn about what happens to the output and profits of firms that were privatized. And the authors are able to show that actually it was the profits and output of those privatized firms that went to Ben Ali family who were more had a competitive edge. So they were more profitable and they had high levels of output. Other privatized firms, or indeed other firms in the industry, their profits significantly lagged behind. Similar story in the case of Iran for privatization, because privatization here is more like a pseudo privatization, but a key distinguishing feature of the Iranian context is that the state-owned enterprises were transferred to organizations such as the semi-public organizations, the Martyrs Foundation, the IRG, etc., rather than families. And what you find in the Iranian context is evidence of the changing structures of institutional ownership, greater diversification of ownership types, rather than the concentration of firms under a single owner. And that clearly is rooted in Iran's distinct political economy, its legacy of conflict, sanctions, its need to deliver to broader social constituencies. My own work with Ferdinand Eibel on trade policy similarly looked at EU-induced trade reform and looked at how that trade reform differentially benefited connected versus unconnected firms. So here is the setup. We set up two quasi-policy experiments. In each case, in around 2005, you have the Egypt-EU trade agreement, which becomes effective, and it's part of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. In Morocco, the same trade agreement came through in 2000. And what we look at is how tariffs, this bar that's coming down in gray, average tariff rates are falling. But what we show is that actually it was a key episode of partial trade liberalization, in the sense that while tariff barriers came down, the non-tariff measures, the procedural regulations increased, and they increased more for connected sectors than for unconnected sectors. So here are two interesting plots. If you look at crony sectors, the dark line, you could see although the share of non-tariff measures, the cumulative density of it increased for all sectors, but increased by much larger proportion for connected sectors than for unconnected sectors. In Morocco, we show that actually the same pattern is taking place, but it's not the royal firms, it's actually the non-royal firms, largely politician-owned firms, which experience a dramatic rise in the non-tariff measures. And that's partly rooted in the fact that I've already described. The royal family is less invested in the manufacturing sector. We also show that these non-tariff measures, if you distribute them by type, such as the technical barriers to trade, the large majority of these barriers are those that require inspection requirements. They are susceptible to political abuse. They also give us an interesting perspective on the hope and despair of economic reform. For those of you who've read Bassam Haddad's book, there's an interesting quote by Abdullah al-Dardari where he says, well, the rent-seeking networks are still around, but now it's the WTO, and therefore, there will be more competition. What we find actually is in line with what Luigi Zingales said in Political Theory of the Firm, which is that as the size and complexity of regulation increases, it becomes easier for vested interests to tilt the level playing field. We have similar evidence in Morocco. I know I'm short of time, so I'll just wind up in literally half a minute. There's evidence from Turkey, which looks at about 18,000 procurement contracts in Turkey, and there's evidence that a lot of these contracts are actually going to AKP-affiliated firms. Evidence on Tunisia by Laila Baghdadi et al. Shows us that a lot of these Ben Ali firms primarily operated in those sectors that were highly regulated, which is to say they were protected by regulation. That is why they have higher output and higher profitability. I'll end on that note. Obviously, there are interesting patterns. Why does this cronyism matter? How is it situated in its political settlement? Ishac will talk a great deal about that, and I'll also follow up in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeel, and thank you, MEI, for the invitation. I'm loading my slides. I'm going to take you. Do they show? Can you see my slides? Yeah. So I'm going to take you from the micro, where Adeel started, understanding which firm is connected and which is not, and through which mechanism does it get particular privileges from the states, how this boosts its own profitability, which allows it to beat its competitors. What's the impact of this on the sector, job creation at the sector level? What's the impact of this on the whole economy, on economic performance in the macro realm, and also what's the impact on politics? So we're jumping to the macro. I'll start with politics, then I'll be more precise on the impact on economic performance, which is where we have most of our results. And then I'll have a slide on how we can think about the future after the Arab Spring and given the challenges of the future. First, the effect on politics are very important in the sense that cronyism or that particular shape of state business relations after privatization and after the structural adjustment period of the 90s is in many ways for us what explains the mystery of autocratic resilience in the Arab world. That is, regimes supposedly opened up to the market because they had to. The previous strategy didn't work anymore, but they did not open their polity. They did not democratize, as, for example, Latin America or Africa did when they had to liberalize their economy. And so this liberalization was very partial. They basically opened up to a private sector controlled by their friends so that they are able to actually control the private sector and stay in charge. And so compared to other regions in the world, when you look at this personalized contract between a big businessman who's a client of a politician, there is an exchange between the two. The businessman, they're mostly men, very few women, gets privileges, all those mechanisms that Adeel described, but then he gives something in return to the patron. And this something, we classified it at 3 levels because it gives rise to a different kind of political economy equilibrium. At the minimum, what he gives back is wealth, money, to bind the political and economic elite together, and also for electoral finance, especially when competition, electoral competition, like in Turkey, for example, is important, or in Egypt at particular moments. At a higher level, larger ranks could finance larger clientelistic networks that are the key supporters of the regime. And yet, at a higher level, let's say, of economic destruction, the goal, the political goal of cronyism is really to occupy the heights of the economy so that it is denied to the opposition, so that the private sector that develops is not a supporter of political parties that oppose the ruling class. And we will argue that this is the most destructive form of cronyism because it occupies really the gross sectors of the economy. And it's characteristic, actually, of cronyism in the region, as we came to call it, the Arab form of crony capitalism, which resembles in some ways the Russian one, but is quite different from the Latin or the Asian one. Now, it is a type of regime where repression of markets goes together with the repression of people, and it leads to an economy and a polity that are very divided between formal and informal firms, formal and informal workers, growing inequalities between billionaires and poorer small businesses, and one that doesn't allow the kind of cooperation, social cooperation that's needed for middle-income countries to grow into higher middle income or richer countries, as the literature, recent literature in political science shows going beyond the middle income trap requires a lot of cooperation, which is not available in these very divided societies. The chapters by Stefan Hertog and myself at the end of the book cover that broad characterization of the political economy of the region. Now, let's focus a bit more on economic performance in that particular environment. Now, a priori, we were open, or we are open to the idea that some type of close relationship between business people and politicians could actually favor growth. We've seen that in many countries. Korea is the paragon, with the chaebols getting privileges, but were very closely managed by General Park at the moment for performance. They had to export, otherwise they ended up in jail. And so it is possible that those deals between politicians and business people serve economic growth. But at the same time, there are conceptually headwinds, and we find headwinds in many of our studies. And I will list them to you in terms of order of importance. What is it in this relation that could actually weigh down on economic growth? The first is the misallocation of factor of production. Firms getting access to credit, to skilled workers, to the best lands, may not be the firms that are the best run. They are the friends of the president, as opposed they're loyal rather than good managers. And so there could be misallocation of funds, which lowers not necessarily the growth rate of an economy, but its level of productivity. They also misuse public funds. They get all procurement and they don't deliver the cheaper services to the state. They also consume subsidies. So that's the first level, misallocation. The second level is more dynamic. These are economies where you tend to have little of what makes market economy special, which is competition, competitive forces, pushing the best firms to take over from bad firms, creative destruction, to improve the efficiency of the economy, to come up with innovation, to diversify products because of the forces of competition. There are economies that tend to be dominated by monopolies, and therefore where this innovation doesn't happen. That's the second level of headwinds that affect the growth rates. And there is third level that's been quite destructive in the region, which is the lobbying by these firms to shape economic policies in ways that advantage them. In particular, protecting them from foreign competitors, closing borders to trade in goods, to FDI, foreign direct investment, as Adeel argued, to keep regulation overly high, because these are systems where regulations are applied on your enemies and deals are applied to your friends. These over-regulation leads to more dualism between a big chunk of the economy, which is informal markets, and a few modern firms dominated by these cronies. And more generally, they get these economies stuck in this trap, as I described it earlier, where they don't innovate, governments don't push for structural change, big changes in society that get people to move, say, from rural to urban areas into good jobs, to go through the education system and land into the export sector. And finally, in some countries more than others, we have extremely narrow types of cronyism and capitalism, as in Syria or in Algeria, where literally a few families control what is the private economy and all the rest is informal. So we want to give you some examples of very specific findings on those different kind of levels of inefficiencies. So let me start with an example in Egypt, where I've done some work with co-authors. The PCFs here stands for politically connected firms. We find 35 highly connected individuals own directly or indirectly about 400 large firms. They get, in 2010, 85% of the credit going to the private sector in Egypt. They get 60% of total corporate profits, and yet they generated only 11% of employment. So these are highly capitalized firms compared to the rest of the economy, capital intensives. Now we look at over time at when they enter a sector and what happens to competition in that sector when they enter over time. And we find that 5 years after they enter a sector, that sector become very skewed, as shown in the graph, in the sense that the middle-sized firms in that sector disappear and the sector gets polarized between the big cronies and an informal sector. An example would be connected firms get the most beautiful parts of land in Cairo to open big supermarkets, so they modernize. They modernize distribution of consumer goods, but by doing so with their unfair advantage, they kill all the middle-sized shops and they end up being competed on only by the very small night shops. And so the market gets polarized. So by doing that, they create jobs, but we show that what happens is that overall in the sector, there are less jobs after the entry because they are very capital intensive, partly because they have very good access to capital. And so we calculate here that over the 10-year period, we would have had 25% higher job creation in Egypt if we were to compare it to a fully competitive imaginary economy. And another very interesting result, which is out of Egypt, is the motive for cronyism. Of course, we don't observe that, so we have to speculate. But we say if they enter in rent-filled sectors, oil and the like, lands, which they do, then typically this is the type of cronyism that we observe in the rest of the world for political finance. Politicians have the ability to provide rents in those sectors, and typically it's for political finance. On the other hand, if we see them entering the growth sectors, the sectors that are supposedly growing fastest, then it's likely to be for defensive purposes to prevent other businesses that are not connected to the regime from entering these sectors. The costly form of cronyism, of exclusion that I talked about. And we see in Egypt, we observe that actually the sectors they enter in are sectors that in the rest of the world are growing very fast, growing at 1.5% faster than other sectors in the rest of the world, but not in Egypt after the cronies entered them. And so this is an indirect way of characterizing this costly type of capitalism. In Lebanon, we find a very different genre of cronyism, one that's very much clientelistic. The big connected firms in Lebanon overhire as opposed to underhire in Egypt. And this is because we think the main payback to politicians that these firms give is they are part of the clientelistic network. And indeed, we see them, as you see in the graph, hiring most, the red line, just around elections. Here, the election of 2009, they hire massively before election, they invade markets, and the rest of the markets basically collapse. And on net, their unfair competition, again, produces less jobs than otherwise. And looking around the region, we find several other types of cronyism, the diversity that Adeel talks about. The Tunisian case is very similar to the Egyptian case. It's the occupation of the height of the economy. Any successful business was basically acquired, predated by the Ben Ali family in order to prevent the opposition from rising, with some very specific, well-known cases of kind of traditionally opposition big families being pushed to leave Tunisia. The GCC, I'm sure Karen will talk much more about, is quite different. Here, the access to markets are very much restricted to large conglomerates dominated by the royals, partly owned by the states, and this has led to kind of a rejection of Saudization strategies and an attempt to create jobs for young Saudis in the private sector. And of course, is something under attack right now with fast-changing policies under MBS. Syria and Algeria are cases of very narrow capitalism, where just a few big business people, Makhlouf in Syria, Rabrab, Haddad in Algeria, all under attack, all more or less in jail right now, have dominated a very small formal private sector. Iraq in the recent period is a very kind of competitive, closer to Lebanon, a competitive crony system, if you like, which is very much clientelistic. Now, not all the systems we look at have low performance. Turkey, which Adeel talked a little bit about, is a very positive experience where the AKP actually manages to get 10 years of fast growth and re-election, some kind of a virtuous circle, by helping small pious firms in small towns, they got called the Anatolian tigers, to actually enter and start joining the growth process in Turkey and become exporters into these new markets that were opening up in Northern Europe. And so a virtuous, and voting the regime back in power. And so giving us this constellation of political and economic forces that allow us for 10 years of growth that collapsed recently.
Ishac, you may want to conclude rapidly.
I'll conclude. So looking ahead, we're in a new region. Oil prices have come down. Diversification now is the key word. The youth want jobs. The global solutions to get these growth paths going were either the embedded autonomy of Asia, performing public sector, or the liberal-based democracies in Europe based on middle classes. Both type of capitalism are not likely in the Middle East. What are the possibilities as we see them today? A few ideas for our discussion. First of all, regime change after the revolution destroy existing connection and leads, at least in the short term, to less growth because property rights disappear and they need to be rebuilt, possibly based on new connections or based on the rule of law. Tunisia, a messy democracy, political competition doesn't automatically lead to the rule of law. It actually, in the short term at least, democratizes corruption. And so we get messy competition, messy corruption. And the hope is that these regimes could improve by improving the rule of law over time. We see a type of populism with state capitalism in Egypt with the army, but also in Saudi Arabia around MBS, where growth would be driven by the state and hopefully by relation between the state and types of firms that are not scary politically, small and medium enterprises. This is a plan in the making in these countries. Other countries like Algeria could join. We have still to see the jury's out whether this will work. We have the monarchical management, Jordan, Morocco, trying to manage these crony relations well, but that increasingly find middle classes and happy populations and need to find ways to improve the quality of education and innovation in order to push to a higher level. And finally, there's the question of whether the AKP strategy of a virtual circle would be reproduced by any country. Example, Nahda taking over in Tunisia, developing links with small pious firms and going up on this kind of path. So open questions for the future and for our discussion. Back to you. Sorry if I was too long.
That's okay. Thank you. So it's fascinating stuff. So it's very hard to cut you off when you're saying such important things. But thank you very much. And maybe we'd like to hear from Karen on how she would approach the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to MEI for inviting me, and big congratulations to Adeel and Isaac and their co-authors for this really fantastic book. And it was really a lot of fun for me to read it. And I think the mark of a good edited volume like this is what questions it generates. And this, for me, I think, the book in itself is not trying to give a general theory of cronyism or corruption or an explanation of failure of economic performance across the region, but really to give, I think, a display of comparative analysis. It's very data driven, and it's not ideologically mandating. It's quite neutral, and I think that's really the strength of the work. It's difficult, though, to use a concept like crony capitalism because it's sort of a borrowed term, right? And it's a loaded term in many ways. And when we try to do cross-regional work, you know, there's a lot that comes with it. Other concepts that might be as useful, you know, this is about a stalled statist project, right, across the region. And it's really about this process of liberalization that meets this endpoint in your research of 2011 and the Arab Spring. And now the period that we're entering now, which is quite complicated as well. All capitalism, of course, depends on networks, on trust, on relationships. And this isn't always a bad thing, right? So cronyism in itself or networking in itself is actually a strength of a capitalist system. And we've seen in, you know, cross-regional work on the South Korean cabal, for example, the revolving doors, which can be quite powerful. And I think one of the findings that comes out in the chapters is this question of the degree of internationalization and the kind of focus on domestic non-tradables, as you describe them, as sectors where this kind of market disruption or lack of productivity seems to thrive. State-business relations are always messy, but one useful concept that you use in the book is the nature of inclusive versus exclusive institutions. And I think you do that very powerfully. And I love that you refer to the work of Douglas North, who's really kind of my guiding star in terms of thinking of political economy. But across the region, of course, there's some really important variations in circumstance. And, you know, who controls what resources in the resource-rich states of the Gulf? You know, the structures are very, very different, right? So who controls the main drivers of the economy? What are they? And your difference in focus on these kind of domestic non-tradables, the tourism, financial services, the manufacturing. Why do we get different outcomes? And the degree of internationalization and competition, is that really the driving factor? This book brought up a lot of questions for me, particularly, you know, one about demographics. You know, when we think about the region, we often understand the success, and you mentioned this, I think, in the first chapter, the success of the economic development and social human development indicators that we've seen over the last 40 years. And so my question then is, you know, when we see good progress in education, maternal health, life expectancy, has that expansion reinforced privilege and hoarding behavior of elites? Has the elite base really changed at all in the last 40 years? And so this is more of a question of class, of ethnic base, of privilege. And in the Jordanian chapter, I think you get to this a bit. On your methodology and defining what it means to be a politically connected firm, this concept that you use throughout the book, I think it's very conservative in the way that, that it's been operationalized, in that you try to track party membership, tracking publicly listed firms and their leadership, and then those individuals' connections to government. You know, in more open economies, there are lots of ways of exerting political influence through think tanks, lobby organizations, PR campaigns, advertising, messaging. And we don't necessarily think that these are counter to market operations or that they are detrimental to the public good. So what's the difference? And I would think, you know, the difference really in the cases that you describe is about governance, and it's about civil society, the ability to form interest groups, particularly business interest groups, is simply absent, illegal in much of the Middle East. And I think this is an area where we could do more fruitful exploration. One question that popped into my mind as we're looking at the cases that I study, I've been looking at the UAE, and of course the normalization with Israel. And one of the sectors which is set to grow considerably is this golden diamond, the jewelry industry and this diamond trade. And this is a highly networked sector, right? Highly personalistic, based on family ties. How does a sector like that compete and transfer in a new environment, going from Belgium to Dubai as a global trading center for diamonds? So this is a really, it kind of just prompted my thinking of, what does this mean when highly networked sectors then become engaged in areas where we've seen, traditional cronyism. The mechanisms of cronyism that you describe, the role of the military is of course important in Egypt, but not everywhere. In the Gulf, in the monarchies, land is the key valve of control in the real estate sector, but also in the ability to control licensing of franchise, the sort of commercial rules of bringing business to the Gulf. But this was also very successful as an economic development model to create a generation of entrepreneurs where they didn't exist before. So in terms of social development, it's been quite good. And it's also served as a kind of independent interest group to a degree, a weak one, which is counter to ruling families. So I wonder again, this question of domestic versus international, how global reach and franchises, how does this mix with your conception? One thing that Ishac's work brings up, which I think is maybe the most important issue in thinking about economic performance and growth in the region, is access to credit. And one change that we are seeing in this sort of COVID crisis and the twin crisis of oil price decline and the pandemic is that the early evidence in kind of year-to-date increase in lending to the private sector in the Gulf is that government-related entities are receiving an astounding disproportion of credit. So in the UAE, for example, in the last year, private lending, so the bank sector lending to government-related entities, was nearly 20 times the expansion of what the private sector, not just small businesses, but private businesses as a whole received. The same was true, it grew about 20% year on year in Qatar, whereas the private sector lending grew only about 6%. Saudi was not quite as extreme. But the general trend across the region is that SMEs receive a tiny portion of bank lending. And even if it's a government policy to try and support this sector, we see the overwhelming amount of credit support still going to government-related entities. You talk also about financial markets and equity markets. In the Gulf, this is also a little bit different because of the high presence of state ownership and investment in publicly listed firms. In the Saudi Tadawul, for example, most of the major firms traded, or the largest firms traded on the exchange, have some measure, a substantial measure of government ownership. And we've seen governments actively intervening to shore up the prices of those entities as well. But my question to you would be, what do you see as a potential change as we're seeing this move towards emerging market index inclusion across Gulf equity markets? Is this going to improve performance? What does the institutional investor have to say about these kinds of firms and their ownership structures? Privatization is also changing in the region, particularly in the Gulf, and particularly into sectors where the state has been the largest owner. So in the oil and gas industry, we're seeing more sell-offs of pipelines, concession agreements, which really do change the nature of ownership, which will be pretty interesting to see how governments react. And what happens when, especially in the Gulf, again, the context that I know best, when the government owns portions of large firms, particularly as we're seeing now in construction and real estate, and allows them to fail? How do we explain that? The failure of Saudi Auger, of Bin Laden Group, now of Arab Tech, with massive investment from state firms, from sovereign wealth funds. And the jobs problem, it always comes back to jobs across MENA. Politically connected firms, as your research clearly shows, are not good employers. As Ishac's work on Egypt shows, they don't hire a lot of people, they don't train and promote people, they're not looking to build the next managerial class, the next generation. And this is a pervasive weakness that we find across the region. I love that you try to do cross-regional comparison and think about how cronyism in MENA is perhaps different than what we've seen in Latin America or in Southeast Asia. And I know the Latin America cases a bit as well. The kind of ownership structures that were created in the Caudillo systems, these were based on the subjugation of race, right? And so in MENA, how does this translate? How do we explain the this concentration of ownership? The last kind of question I think that this prompted from me was from Stefan Hertog's chapter on kind of asking what makes the Arab variety of capitalism different, or is it, or can we even define such a thing? And I think it's about this jobs problem. The history of statist development continues to promise and overspend, but it's more and more rationed, more and more unable to deliver, especially on employment, and unable to boost productivity and really create that kind of next generation of people who are willing to organize around interest groups and challenge the state. So my discussant role is really just to say, you guys prompted so many questions for me. I think I thought of 8 research projects that I could do, off the top of my head, just prompted by some of the findings and the questions that you're asking. So I commend you on that work and just sort of opening the field to further research. And I look forward to seeing what comes out of your next projects.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think it's a very rich book, as you point out. It's very difficult to spend only an hour on such a very important topic. And we could go on for more than an hour, for many days probably. And as you said, there will be a lot coming out of all this over the years. One thing I noticed in the book myself that you have not covered really, or that you really cannot or do not want to touch, is the causality of all this. What causes cronyism? And of course, it's an international, you mentioned Korea, you mentioned Latin America, Karen did, and so on. But is there anything that causes this cronyism just in the Arab world? And that makes it very tricky because, as you point out in the book, and as Karen mentioned, the cronyism is very different from one country to the other. And I think there was an attempt at one point, even by Stefan in his introduction, that it is due to the very strong state. But is it just due to authoritarianism, or is it due to monarchies, or however it is? So it would be quite interesting to see if one day you can actually tackle the whole notion of the causality, almost the sociological causality of cronyism. And is it something typical to the Middle East, or probably not, in fact, probably not just typical of the Middle East. But it's very interesting. One point I would like to make is that if we are going to do something on including the Gulf, you have to be a lot more precise about the Gulf itself, because there are many, many firms in Saudi Arabia that have absolutely no relationship to the royal family that are extremely successful. In fact, they are successful because they don't deal with the royal family. And they know that very well. I mean, when I put my consultant hat and I tell anybody in the US, if you're going to do business in Saudi Arabia, never do business with the royal family. And I'm not the only consultant who says that. I think most quality consultants will try to say that as well. So anyway, I would like perhaps Adeel and you, Ishac, to comment on some of the points that Karen has made. And unfortunately, we're going to run out of time for any further questions. But I think a lot of the questions I see on the list have been covered by the points made by Karen. Go ahead, please.
Can I offer just a 1 minute sort of introduction to this? I mean, Karen has already mentioned about this sort of international evidence on cronyism. We know for a fact that a lot of these countries from South Korea to Indonesia, Philippines had family-based networks, political networks. Even the historical experience of the United States and Britain suggests that. I think Douglas North's observation I find very powerful when he says that all economic organizations in the early stage of development are also political organizations. And in many cases, the firms need protection from the state, protection from the threat of expropriation. Now, the same state that can protect firms can also usurp them. And therefore, cronyism could be a second best solution in certain contexts. In the MENA region, however, we highlight 6 different reasons why these firms are differentially situated. And one of them is exclusion. Is this the sheer scale of exclusion where there are higher barriers to entry, and these are political barriers as well, and they're very blunt instruments, what I call a partner or perish syndrome, right? So you either you can grow up to a particular level, and beyond that level, you have to either partner with the regime insider or be prepared to face exclusion. And the other difference is, I mean, there are many differences here, but another difference is limited export orientation. I mean, one of the reasons why Turkey is different is because a lot of its firms that are part of the religious network are competing with other firms in international markets. So they might have domestic advantages like Korea's chaebols had or Indonesia's firms had, but ultimately they had to compete in the global market. So I think that aspect of exclusion is important. And very quickly to Karen's point, most of those I agree. One key difference, a lot of these findings apply to the Gulf, but one key difference is that in the very oil-rich countries, there is less need in terms of political economy to generate rents for business elites, because they have a lot of rents from oil that they can distribute. And that's why state contracts, monopolies, state investments in different sectors are very important. Ishac.
Not much to add in 30 seconds. I think, Adeel, you brought back the central point, which is firms are political entities as well. And so looking into the future of how this autocratic resurgence on the one hand, or move to competitive economy in Tunisia and hopefully in other countries soon, we got to think of both sides of the relationship. It's not enough to say, do reforms. The question is how politics influence economics and how economic influence politics. And so it's how a whole system can evolve. How can General Sisi respond to this predicament of, on the one hand, needing jobs for the youth, but on the other hand, not wanting to letting go of the private sector, which is now, by the way, only investing 6% of GDP in Egypt, lower than under Nasser. He's just not comfortable with these people. So he's going to try to bring in FDI. He's going to try to have the army do the job. He's going to try to cultivate small enterprises that do not have political power. Will that work? MBS predicament. He is letting the bigger oil companies fail because, and this is a big improvement, because he's making space for these SMEs that would support his populism and hopefully, and that's the bet, re-dynamize these markets and employ Saudis in producing at higher level of technology these services that the big firms right now produce with enormous labor intensity with cheap imported labor. So in all cases, we need to be thinking of reforms in both the political and the economic spheres, and it's only when there is a parallelism that is lucky in some sense would the regime be able, like the AKP, to grow out of its mess for a while. It's these conjunctions of economics and political successes that would allow regimes or not to address the challenges of the future.
Well, thank you, everyone. This is a fascinating piece of work, and I highly encourage everyone to have a look at it, because it's one learns a lot. It's very detailed, and as Karen mentioned, this will create a lot of work for other people in the very near future. So Ishac, thank you very much. Adeel, it's good to see you. Thank you for all your great effort and helping carry all this through. Karen, thank you very much for joining us and your enlightened comments. So again, congratulations. Thank you very much. And I hope we can do and have more topics based on this book coming in the near future. Thank you very much, everyone.